Whenever a new Pokemon title is released, the competitive metagame drastically changes, with new mechanics, options, and entirely new Pokemon, completely redefining what is considered top tier. Some Pokemon maintain their competitive relevance from game to game, if they're fundamentally strong enough and prove useful in the new title. But sometimes a Pokemon that was never seen in competitive play just one generation ago can suddenly become a central presence in the new game, whether that be from direct buffs or just fitting more nicely into the new generation, inadvertently benefiting from new mechanics. Let's go through each generation of competitive and try to single out the one Pokemon that got the best game-to-game glow-up. Which Pokemon was buffed the most in the generational shift? But first, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to help us back up Makago, our collective favorite Pokemon, in his attempt to claim a rightful seat on the Horse Council. Since Makago does in fact learn the move High Horsepower, he has put forth the argument that he is a horse and deserves a place among his own kind. Is this valid? Only time will tell. Thank you. In Generation 2, a lot of Pokemon got significantly buffed in the game-to-game transition, and I think the most obvious example is of course Snorlax. Snorlax gained a massive new special defense stat, access to the new item Leftovers, which it benefited from greatly thanks to its massive base HP, and of course the new move Curse, one of the most significant buffs ever, turning Snorlax into a monstrous central Pokemon, and the best Pokemon in the game. But Snorlax was already one of the best Pokemon in Gen 1, so I wouldn't call this the biggest buff in the game. Golem is another contender here. Golem got significantly buffed, gaining access to Rapid Spin, a crucial new option in a world where spikes now exist, a form of hazard removal. Golem is also a good check to Snorlax, and it can now use mixed coverage a bit more effectively. Fire Blast being a more relevant option now that steel types exist in the game and are quite common. But Golem was also decent in Gen 1. Machamp got significantly buffed. It got access to Curse, a fantastic new boosting option, and it got actual stab moves to use, Cross Chop being the most significant. Back in Gen 1, all you had was Low Kick, which had a terrible base power, and Submission, which is just awful, so fighting types having actual moves now was a big boon for Machamp, going from pretty bad to quite solid. Marowak also got significantly buffed in the game-to-game transition, gaining access to its exclusive new held item, the Thick Club, which doubles its attack stat, turning it into a really solid wall breaker. But I would have to give the crown for biggest buff from Gen 1 to Gen 2 to Nidoking. In Gen 1, Nidoking is horrible. Psychic weakness from that poison typing is one of the worst traits you can have in a world dominated by powerful psychic types like Alakazam, Starmie, and Exeggutor. Ground, water, and ice weakness also suck. These are some of the most popular offensive types in Gen 1. Poison provides no defensive value because toxic is rarely seen, fighting resistance and poison resistance are basically irrelevant. And while ground typing is good and you have a solid move pool, your stats are mediocre and you're vastly outclassed by such options as Rhydon. But in Gen 2, Nidoking turned from a unusable Pokemon in OU to one of the best offensive threats in the format. Poison type was no longer that much of a detriment because Psychic types weren't as popular as they were in Gen 1. The move Psychic itself was nerfed, no longer having a 30% special drop chance, making it one of the best moves in the game. Now it simply had a 10% special defense drop chance. Dark and Steel types were introduced to the game, Dark being immune to Psychic completely and Steel resisting Psychic, significantly nerfing the type. While Toxic still wasn't the most common move ever in Gen 2, Poison immunity became a bit more relevant as a defensive trait, as did fighting resistance, and Nidoking's offensive move pool felt way more useful in this particular metagame. Your Stab Earthquake felt great against such new threats as Raikou, the various steel types, and of course Tyranitar. Ice coverage was great against Zapdos, who is extremely common. Thunder greatly threatens Cloyster, another of the most common Pokemon in the format. And Fire Blast is fantastic against enemies like Forretress and Scum. Access to the new option of Lovely Kiss, a 75% accurate sleeping move, was also a great way for Nidoking to generate momentum. Thief was another significant new option on Nidoking, granting it a form of item removal. And with Leftovers being everywhere and representing a lot of healing over the course of the game, thiefing an incoming Zapdos or Snorlax is massive. Despite pretty low stats, Nidoking's wide offensive move pool that threatens so much of the metagame, and offensive tools like sleep and item removal make it this all-in-one, all-purpose offensive threat that is a cornerstone of offensive teams in Generation 2. And I would personally say this is the most significant buff from Gen 1 to Gen 2. And how about Gen 3? This is a generation that saw significant mechanical changes with the introduction of abilities, the introduction of the EV system, and new held items to take advantage of. And a lot of Pokemon really benefited from all these changes. What immediately comes to mind is probably Tyranitar, the king of Gen 3 OU, who received Sandstream, the most metagame defining ability, sets permanent sandstorm on the field, and of course, Dragon Dance, a new boosting move that would also define the identity of this generation. It was quite a significant increase in viability, but you also have to consider that back in Gen 2, Tyranitar was still solid and it was still OU ranked. We can do better than this. Skarmory and Blissey were significantly buffed, Skarmory gaining access to spikes and benefiting from the new world of permanent sandstorm since it is immune, Blissey gaining natural cure and more utility options. But once again, both of these Pokemon were ranked in OU last game. And what about Aerodactyl? In Gen 2, Aerodactyl was a pretty average physical attacker who wasn't a great fit, but in Gen 3, Aerodactyl is one of the scariest Pokemon in the entire format, taking fantastic advantage of the new Choice Band item, benefiting greatly from the ability to now stack 3 spikes, helping it apply more pressure to the walls that it invites in, and also being spike immune, which is more relevant now, and sand immune, which is imperative. This was a significant buff, but I still think we can do better. What about Magneton? In Gen 2, Magneton was ranked in UU, which is actually alright, mostly off the back of its high special attack stat and decent electric steel typing, but in Gen 3, Magneton gained the ability Magnet Pull, turning it into one of the format's most important trappers. Magneton can eliminate Skarmory, which is a concept you can build teams around, since Skarmory is the primary defensive physical wall of the format. So Magneton also turned from a pretty average Pokemon into a central presence. But I believe that the single most buffed Pokemon in Gen 3 was Dugtrio. Without an ability in Generation 2, Dugtrio was horrible. It was only ranked in NU with a measly 80 base attack. It didn't achieve much. But Gen 3 would turn Dugtrio into one of the scariest Pokemon of all time, granting it the ability Arena Trap, which prevents the enemy Pokemon from switching out if they are grounded. The ability to reliably trap and eliminate certain targets, including Tyranitar, Metagross, Jirachi, Blissey, Celebi, and the list goes on, is enormous, and it's another concept you can build teams around. Dugtrio's Arena Trap has a massive impact on the metagame as a whole, changing how people play, determining what's viable. Pokemon that are weak to ground suffer a lot because they're prone to getting trapped by Dugtrio's Earthquake and eliminated. In many generations, Dugtrio's Arena Trap ability is actually banned outright for how much it can warp things. In Gen 3, this is not the case because the act of locking into Earthquake leaves you vulnerable. It is a momentum loss that can be exploited, and the metagame skews towards ground immune Pokemon to begin with. Porygon 2 also exists as a form of counterplay to Dugtrio, tracing its Arena Trap, but I can pretty confidently call this the most significant buff from Gen 2 to Gen 3. And now we move on to Generation 4, another game with significant mechanical shakeups, most notably the introduction of the physical special split, which allowed any move to be both physical and special attacking. The physical special split expanded things massively and made it so that way more Pokemon could take advantage of their primary attacking stat with same type attack bonus, which previously was impossible in many situations. A lot of Pokemon was significantly buffed because of this, too many to list all of them, but the most obvious one is probably Gyarados, who previously could not use physical water type attacks because they didn't exist, but now it could use Waterfall, and with its massive attack stat and access to Dragon Dance, along with new items to take advantage of like Life Orb, Gyarados shot up in viability significantly. However, Gyarados was already ranked OU in Gen 3, so I don't think you could call this the biggest buff. Jirachi went from good to outstanding, gaining access to options like Stab Iron Head, a physical attacking Fire Punch, and just more options to take advantage of overall. But Jirachi was already a top tier choice in Gen 3 too. Dragonite turned from a UUBL Pokemon completely outclassed by other options into an OU force to be reckoned with. Dragonite could take advantage of the newly buffed Physical Outrage, which had 120 power off the back of a 134 base attack stat. This is one of the hardest hitting moves in the entire game. Dragonite also benefited massively as a mixed attacker with new options like Draco Meteor to take advantage of. But I think that the most buffed Pokemon in Generation 4 was actually Scizor. In Gen 3, Scizor was quite average. It was UUBL ranked, but I think it's harder to use on OU teams than some UU or NU ranked Pokemon, to be honest. Scizor lacks good attacking option. Hidden Power Bug is its best physical attacking stab move, and it is significantly outclassed by fellow bug-type physical attacker Heracross, who actually has Mega Horn to hit hard with. Scizor can use Indoor Reversal sets, being one of the only indoor sweepers immune to sand, which is something, but these sets are inconsistent and easy to play around. But in Gen 4, Scizor was extremely blessed. Scizor gained the new ability Technician, which is a fantastic offensive ability. Technician grants a 1.5 times power boost to any move with 60 base power or less. And the new Steel-type physical attack Bullet Punch was a perfect option to take advantage of this new ability. Bug Bite and Pursuit were other options benefiting from this new ability. Scizor also gained access to U-Turn, one of the best and most significant new additions to Gen 4, a 70 power bug-type physical attack that switches you out after use. This move has been a staple of competitive singles ever since it was released. Anything with access to it will probably use it because it's that good. Attacking and gaining information, keeping up momentum, switching out at the same time. It's an inherently very powerful concept, and Scizor has a massive attack stat and stab on U-turn, making it one of the most powerful users of one of the most powerful moves. And access to Superpower was another significant buff for Scizor, especially against Magnezone, giving you some solid coverage to be able to hit one of your greatest enemies. Scizor went from bad to great in Gen 4, and I would call it the most buffed Pokemon in the transition. In Gen 5, a lot of hidden abilities were added to the game, which drastically shifted the identities of many Pokemon. Gliscor is one of the most significant, who got access to Poison Heal in Generation 5, which is one of the best abilities in Pokemon. Poison Heal means that instead of getting damaged by poison, you get healed by it for 1/8 of your max HP every turn, which is double that of leftovers. On top of this, you have an effective status immunity, because you're already poisoned, so you can't be burned or paralyzed or put to sleep or anything. Gliscor shot up in viability massively with this change and has been an OU staple ever since. Even in Gen 9, it remains powerful. But Gliscor was ranked OU back in Gen 4 as well, so this is not the most significant buff. What about Alakazam, who gained Magic Guard in Generation 5? Magic Guard, also one of the best abilities in the entire game, even to this day, granting a complete immunity to indirect damage. This includes hazards, Sandstorm, status damage, effects like Leech Seed, even Life Orb recoil. Alakazam went from a pretty average special attacker outclassed by many other options to one of the scariest offensive threats in the entire game, and a staple of the format, one of the most popular Pokemon on Sand teams since it completely sidesteps the Sandstorm damage, but I still think we can do better. There's bigger buffs to be had. What about Tentacruel, who gained Rain Dish in Generation 5? Rain Dish basically grants an additional leftovers heal if the rain is active. Before this change, Tentacruel was completely outclassed by other water types like Starmie and Melodic, but now Tentacruel is a must-have almost on Rain team, one of the most powerful, sturdy, and reliable rapid spinners in the entire format. And it also greatly benefited from the addition of Scald, one of the most powerful new moves in Gen 5 that has a 30% burn chance attached to it, which is one of the nicest ways to spread a burn. But for Tentacruel to be this good in the first place, Rain needs to be on the field. And who's the one providing the rain? Well, it is the most buffed Pokemon from Gen 4 to Gen 5, of course. Politoed. In Gen 4, Politoed was not really much of anything. It had average stats, it's just a water type like any other, with not much unique to offer, low tier Pokemon. But in Generation 5, Politoed is central. It has Drizzle now, which sets permanent rain on the field. And this was enough to turn Politoed into an S tier Pokemon. Because of this ability, Swift Swim needed to be banned. Permanent rain and Swift Swim was such a powerful combination, it was dominating things to an absurd extent. But even without Swift Swim available, Tentacruel can abuse rain, as can offensive water types like Keldeo and Gyarados. Electric types with Thunder get extremely buffed in the rain, as do Hurricane abusers. The fact that you buff Scald's damage is massively significant. Weather setting abilities are probably the most powerful abilities in the game, especially back when they were permanent in Generation 5, and this goes to show just how good they were. A nothing Pokemon like Politoed overnight became a top tier. just because it got Drizzle. And before I talk about Generation 6, I'm going to make it clear that I'm not counting Mega Evolutions for this, because obviously receiving a Mega Evolution massively buffs you, to the point where you're pretty much an entirely different Pokemon as a Mega form. I'm just going to talk about Pokemon that in their base form got a significant buff from game to game. Generation 6 saw the introduction of the Fairy type, and Pokemon that were previously not Fairy type became Fairy types retroactively. One of the most significant of these was Azumarill, who turned from just a mono water type into a water fairy type. This was a significant buff for Azumarill, giving it offensive and defensive advantages. Azumarill now had dragon immunity, fighting resistance, and dark resistance, giving it more entry points, and it had fairy stab, allowing it to threaten dark fairy and dragon types super effectively. And another significant buff in Generation 6 was to Clefable, who transformed from a normal type into a fairy type, which was a massive upgrade. Clefable already got a massive buff back in Gen 4, receiving Magic Guard, but this transition to fairy typing turned Clefable into a monster. Fairy is a much better type than normal defensively, with some of the most important resistances and that ever-crucial dragon immunity. But I still wouldn't give the title to Clefable for most buffed, because it was still usable in Gen 5, just with Magic Guard alone. Clefable is occasionally seen on stalled teams in Gen 5. But there is a Pokemon who was never really seen in Gen 5 OU who became significantly better from multiple mechanical changes in Gen 6. In Generation 6, one of the most significant move buffs ever happened. The buff to Knockoff, turning it from a simple item removal effect to a much higher power attack that actually dealt significant damage. It was buffed to have 65 base power and deal 1.5 times more damage if you are in the process of knocking off an item, which is obviously most of the time. This change made a lot of Pokemon way better, most notably Bisharp. Bisharp turned from an average physical attacker that was not OU ranked to a really scary threat, commonly used on hyper-offense teams. Bisharp not only benefited from the newly improved knockoff, it also benefited from the presence of Defog in the metagame. Defog is a new hazard removal effect, an alternative to Rapid Spin that clears hazards on both sides of the field and also lowers your enemy's evasiveness. Bisharp has the ability Defiant, which grants ×2 attack if any stat lowering takes place. So Bisharp can actually punish Defog by coming in on that evasiveness lowering and gaining that Defiant boost. Bisharp also benefited from the addition of fairy types to the game. Bisharp is one of the few dark types neutral to fairy defensively, thanks to that secondary steel typing. And with access to steel stab moves, it can also hit fairy types super effectively, which is very important in this metagame where fairy has quickly become one of the new most popular types. So I would call Bisharp the most buffed Pokemon in Generation 6, from really not very good in Gen 5 to receiving benefits from multiple mechanical changes in Gen 6, pushing it to great heights it had never seen before. The most significant mechanical change in Gen 7 was of course the introduction of Z moves. All new buffed versions of moves that can only be used if you have the corresponding Z stone equipped. This newfound ability to deal massive damage or use powerful new support options buffed a lot of different Pokemon. Flying type attackers like Dragonite and Landorus Therian, who didn't really have good physical flying type attacks before, could now use a Z Stone to turn Fly into a huge base power flying type attack that didn't have to charge like Fly did. But these two Pokemon were already OU, of course. Victini benefited greatly from the new Z Stone option, allowing it to use Z Celebrate, which was a boosting Z move. Z Celebrate boosts all of Victini's stats, and with stored power, benefiting from all of these different stat boosts, Victini could be a fantastic late game cleaner and sweeper. But Pokemon were also buffed in other ways. Another of the significant new mechanics in Gen 7 was the introduction of terrain setting abilities on the Tapu Pokemon. One of the greatest benefactors was Holucha. Holucha could now use the new seed items which activate and get consumed in certain terrains, which would not only grant Holucha a important defensive boost, allowing it to safely set up a Swords Dance, it would also activate Unburden, which grants double speed after an item is consumed, turning Holucha from a pretty average Pokemon into a really effective hyper-offensive sweeper. But I would say the most buffed Pokemon in Gen 7 received a simpler buff, not benefiting from sweeping mechanical change, but just getting a good new ability. Much like Politoed before it, Pelipper now received Drizzle, and it became the all-new best rain setter in OU. Ever since Gen 6, weather setting abilities were nerfed to no longer be permanent, but they were still relevant effects. And now that rain was no longer permanent, Swift Swim was no longer banned because it wasn't as much of a problem. There was a bit more counterplay to it. Pelipper overnight went from a terrible Pokemon completely outclassed by many other flying and water types to an archetype defining choice. Pelipper benefits from Drizzle quite a bit itself, with access to Hurricane, which is now perfectly accurate, and of course hard hitting options like Weather Ball. And it really helped that there were a lot of good new rain abusers now. Ash Greninja being one of the most prevalent and outstanding water-type special attacker that benefited enormously from rain. Mega Swampert is also one of the most powerful Swift Swim users we have ever seen, and with Pelipper as a teammate, it could reach great heights as well. Pelipper would go on to define the new identity of rain strategies moving forward. In Generation 8, the all-new mechanic Dynamax was the only generational mechanic in history to be completely banned from Smogon's competitive singles formats. And this was because of mostly one Pokemon, Gyarados, who, thanks to Dynamax, turned into one of the scariest threats competitive singles has ever seen. Dynamax allows a Pokemon to double their HP stat and converts all of their moves into Dynamax moves, which are buffed versions of the moves they already have, for 3 turns. Gyarados, with the ability Moxie and Max Airstream, a powerful flying type Dynamax move that also boosts your speed, could snowball out of control very, very quickly. Not only receiving speed boosts from Max Airstream, but also attack boosts every time it got a KO. So if you're counting a world where Dynamax is allowed, you could call Gyarados the most buffed Pokemon from game to game. But Dynamax was of course banned eventually, so I would not personally count this. Gen 8 also saw the removal of some very important moves in singles, including Hidden Power and Pursuit. The removal of Pursuit served to inadvertently buff all Dark Weak Pokemon, including such fellows as Blacephalon, Victini, and Mew. Gen 8 is also defined by the addition of Heavy Duty Boots to the game, the most powerful competitive singles item since Leftovers, an item that grants a complete immunity to hazards. This redefined the identities of many Pokemon. Probably the most significant benefactor of this new item was Weavile. Weavile has had a place in OU in past generations, but in Generation 7, it wasn't the best. It's always struggled with its rock weakness, but with Heavy Duty Boots, and also the new move Triple Axle, a much better Ice Stab option, Weavile became one of the go-to offensive threats of Gen 8, with Boots allowing it many more entry points and giving it a lot more longevity. But I think the most improved Pokemon from Gen 7 to 8 was actually Zeraora. Back in Gen 7, Zeraora was not the best fit. It was ranked in UU and struggled to really see much usage up in OU. But in Generation 8, Zeraora's popularity skyrocketed. Despite not being rock weak, Zeraora proved that just about any fast pivot could benefit from the value of heavy duty boots. A complete immunity to spikes and stealth rock gave Zeraora so many opportunities to hit the field and pivot out over the course of a game. The rise of Weavile and the introduction of the new Pokemon Dragapult, who quickly became a top tier threat, were also great for Zeraora, who outran both of these Pokemon naturally and threatened massive damage against them. Zeraora is one of the most successful physical attacking electric types in the whole series. Definitely one of the most unique and fun parts about the Gen 8 OU metagame. In the present day of Gen 9 OU, a new mechanic exists called Terastallization, allowing a Pokemon to transform into a new type. And this was able to breathe new life into many Pokemon. Sometimes a little bit too much, actually. Volcarona quickly turned from a fairly manageable threat to now the benefactor of 2 massive new mechanics in a row, pushing it over the edge a little bit, with Heavy Duty Boots to ignore its greatest weakness of Stealth Rock, and Terra to now transform into a powerful defensive type, providing more opportunities to set up Quiver Dance safely and gain coverage in the process sometimes. Volcarona was out of control, and the Pokemon has actually been banned to Ubers. But not all Pokemon have been buffed purely because of the new Terra mechanic. Some are a better fit in this metagame because of moveset cuts and Pokédex cuts. Alomomola has become one of the best defensive Pokemon in OU after formerly never being ranked as high as OU. The move Scald saw significantly cut distribution in Generation 9. Toxapex is the most notable example of a Pokemon that lost access to Scald, but Alomomola kept it, and with more utility like Wish, which is a pretty rare option too, and Flip Turn for safe pivoting, Alomomola is a fantastic regenerator user. Primarina has also seen OU viability for the first time in its career. Formerly outclassed by Tapu Fini, the superior water fairy type who provided more value thanks to Misty Surge, Primarina has risen to fill that role now that Tapu Fini is no longer in the game. Torkoal has also become significantly more popular in Gen 9 thanks to Sun being so much better to set on the field. The new past Paradox forms all have Protosynthesis as an ability, which grants a boost to your highest stat in the Sun. Receiving Drought was a significant buff for Torkoal back in Gen 7, but it wouldn't be until Gen 9 that this Drought effect was useful enough and popular enough to give Torkoal that OU ranking. But the most buffed Pokemon in Generation 9 I would have to give to Ribombee, who came all the way from PU tier up to OU, one of the most significant rises ever. Ribombee has established itself as the premier sticky web setter in the entire metagame, outclassing alternatives like Galvantula and Smeargle. And it has also benefited greatly from the presence of Great Tusk. Great Tusk is the most popular rapid spinner in the format, meaning it's probably the thing that wants to get rid of sticky web most often. But Ribombee has Stab Moonblast and outruns Great Tusk by a lot, very easily one-hit KOing its greatest rival. For this reason, Ribombee is much more effective in Gen 9 than it has ever been. It has been used occasionally as a sticky web setter in fast formats, but never to this much success. And that does it for my list of most buffed Pokemon in each new installment of the franchise. It is interesting to see that buffs can happen in many different ways, whether they be directly applied with a new ability, or a stat buff, or a new typing. Sometimes they're the result of a new generational mechanic to take advantage of, helping enhance your strengths. But sometimes the Pokemon barely changes at all, and the metagame around it has changed, giving it a new role to fill. What do you think of my list, folks? Do you agree or disagree with any of my placements? And what is your favorite Pokemon buff from game to game in the franchise? Mine would have to be the buff to Scizor in Generation 4.